everybody. Welcome to our new DigBoston News and Public Affairs show we're calling InDIGnation. I'm Jason Pramas. I'm DigBoston Executive Editor. And to my right is Chris Faraone, Dig Editor-in-Chief. And we got an interesting show for you today. We're going to start off with Chris letting us, talking to us about the latest, coolest articles that we have on Dig this week. And then Chris and I are going to talk a bit, and then we're going to bring on our special guest, State Representative Mike Connolly. So, stay tuned. It's going to be fun. So, Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Jason. First article I want to talk about this week comes out of Chelsea. One of our photographers, Kiko Hiromi, was the first person to take photographs and to be there when Isabel Gonzalez saw her baby Victoria for the first time after 44 days in quarantine at Mass General Hospital. Pretty remarkable story, a tearjerker for sure. That's not the only reason we ran it, though. Chelsea, as some of you may be aware, more than 60% of the 40,000 people who live there are Latino. And if you're following anything about the pandemic, then you know this is a population that's been particularly impacted. At the time of our reporting, the average rate per 100,000 people statewide was 865. In Chelsea, it's a staggering 5,217. Moving forward, second story we want to talk about is an open letter that we published to UMass President Marty Meehan. Comes from the UMass Unions United. Important stuff. Good luck trying to find a lot of reporting about what's happening in the UMass system. Nevertheless, it's happening. Stuff is happening. There have been foreclosures at universities and colleges across the Commonwealth, and people are standing up for themselves now. There have been furloughs all over the place. You got workers, professors, unions, even certain administrators stepping up. Some of the demands that are laid out in the letter commit to not cutting programs. They want the university to engage with students, with low-level administrators, with professors about reopening. They want job protections naturally, and they want the school to advocate for and prepare to use reserve funds to cover possible shortfalls. Third story, lighting up a little bit, but not that much. This one comes from Zach Huffman. It's about Rob Potylo. Some of you may know him as Robbie Roadsteamer, from the North Shore, Massachusetts, longtime comedian, friend to the creative scene, did the show Quiet Desperation for years here in Boston. He moved to Pasadena in 2016. In the time since, he's been working for Amazon and Whole Foods as a shopper for the most part, delivery driver, and no surprise, Rob started recording videos while he was doing his job at the beginning of the crisis. They're called Coronavirus Mania Hits Whole Foods, noting everything from toilet paper shortages to the work conditions, managers weren't showing up, etc. It's truly hilarious about a sad situation, but needless to say, he was fired. And you got to read this story, check out the videos. They're funny, and there's definitely, there's something more, something important there as well. Fourth, we really will lighten it up a bit. Dennis Mailer, thanks a lot. Reporter covered comedians, two in particular, Andrew Mayer and Dan Martin, who they had big plans for new album releases, and obviously the things didn't go exactly how they had thought they would. Now, this is kind of interesting. Anybody who knows comedians knows they're kind of a miserable bunch. But this is a really interesting conversation. I want to quote Dan Martin in particular said something that really resonated and got me thinking about what's comedy going to look like once this is all over. And he just said, I talked to other comics, and a lot of us don't really miss doing stand-up. He said, I know that sounds weird. He said, I miss people. I miss the interaction, but I don't miss doing my set as much. I definitely don't miss open mics, the desperate feeling, or light crowds. So I also got to say, stay tuned to Dig Boston. We're working on some comedy stuff too. The fifth story I want to get into. This is one that I wrote. It's an op-ed of sorts, and it is a response to a letter published by about 100 restaurateurs across the Commonwealth, led by Dave Andelman of Phantom Gourmet fame, who you may know. And it's a ridiculous letter. It got absolutely no pushback in the media. More than a dozen outlets basically just rewrote it. And what they're trying to do is reopen. They're telling the governor they want to reopen restaurants at limited capacity next week. And then if they want to open full, entirely 30 days after that. And I just couldn't sit there and let it stand. Not one of the other outlets in town thought it was smart or important to reach out to someone who may actually provide some medical advice or say that this is a ridiculous idea. So check that out. And finally, this is my favorite story of the week by Brian Zayats. He's originally from Cape Cod, this reporter, and the headline is "Tone and Consequences of Reopen Debate Escalate on Cape Cod." Listen, Cape Cod is pretty extreme. It's an extreme example for a few reasons. The tourism industry is everything there. So, obviously a lot is riding on this. So there's a lot of pressure, but it's also a proxy for what's going on across the country. Check out the article, some phenomenal photographs in there from the battle on the Cape, a tank like you've only seen in the movies rolling down the streets of Mashpee with big Trump signs all over it. But that brings us into that brings me to the point where I'm going to talk to my colleague Jason Pramas. We're going to talk a little bit about reopening, but first we're going to talk about an editorial that he spearheaded this week, and we all signed on to. It's about Facebook, not exactly a friend to the media, and even though you may have seen that Facebook's giving out some big grants these days. So we did not apply for one at DigBoston, but when we saw who got the grants, one of them in particular, the Boston Globe, got $150,000, presumably to provide more coverage behind a paywall. We kind of jumped at the opportunity to get aggravated with the Globe, like we tend to do. But so really it breaks down. This piece breaks down, everything from what Facebook has done in the past to really decimate media, local media in particular, to these kind of superficial efforts to fund media during the pandemic. And listen, this is really something you're not going to see anywhere else. Most reporters, a lot of editors, publishers are lining up with their hands out. It's understandable, but we just weren't about to get down like that. So definitely check that out. Jason, well done.
Thank you, and our colleague John Loftus, publisher John Loftus, for all the great ideas that we tossed around that resulted in the piece, I think, being as solid as it ended up being. We understand this is kind of insider baseball to some extent, but we do think it's important that we discuss it. The fact that maybe folks don't understand, don't know, haven't heard that Facebook and other digital giants, but particularly Facebook, have really had a lot to do with hurting the fortunes of particularly print newspapers, but also all kinds of news outlets, digital and otherwise. So the editorial is called "Major Newspapers Should Give Back Facebook Grants, and Money Should Go to Local Independent News Outlets the Digital Giant Has Hurt Worst." So, basically, Facebook enticed, especially newspapers and news outlets in general, to bring our audiences to them, starting about 15 years ago when they really got going, when they spread outside of Harvard and Tufts and other, actually local colleges in Boston. For those of you who don't know, this is where it all started here. And then it moved to the West Coast and became a sort of globe-striding, mega billion-dollar operation. Part of that money, though, came from newspapers and other news outlets. We told our audiences to come check us out on Facebook. We would post our content up there. And over time, it became evident that more and more people were just staying there, and they weren't going to our websites where our advertisers are advertising, where there's other ways for us to monetize content so that we can survive. This is both commercial and non-commercial papers and other publications, news publications. And, fast forward 10, 15 years, and a lot of our income has just kind of been taken away from us. And
there's a very basic point that I wanted to be sure to include in it, and which is that we may not like Facebook, but we've cultivated a significant audience there, and unless we pay them a good amount of money too, we actually can't reach that audience. It doesn't matter what the coverage is about. Right. So we can wrap this one up. But basically, they're going out saying that they're helping journalism. And meanwhile, at the very basic thing, all I have to do is turn a switch, and they'd allow outlets like us to reach all of our readers who you'd think.
the data for all of our readers, why don't we see, get all their emails and other information so that we can talk to them directly, and so on and so forth. But our point is just that they're taking away hundreds of millions with one hand and giving back a few million with another hand. And then who do they give it to? Okay, they give it to some publications like us, but they also gave it to quite a few major newspapers, like the Globe, like, the Chicago Tribune, Seattle Times. There's a whole list in our publication, in our article, our editorial. The LA Times got $225,000, for example. And many of these publications are owned by billionaires. They don't need the money, however badly they may treat their staff, even though they're rich, for reasons that we won't go into today. They don't need this money. So that was our big point with that.
Cool. So let's get into the topic that basically everyone's talking about, and
Yep.
then it's perfect because you're talking to Representative Connolly about this. But listen, there's a reason everybody's talking about it. We are 3 days away from the May 18th, the big day. Where the government maker, who really likes to keep everything secret until the last second, is going to have a press conference on Monday and begin a four-stage, alleged four-stage reopening plan. And everybody's in the dark until then, except for golfers. They're already back out. But I don't know, I kind of already had my piece on it. I'm looking at these individual industries like restaurants that we feel bad. They're hurting. We're certainly, we've covered that. But, a lot of people, in my opinion, are taking their personal interest ahead of the general interest at this point. I know you've been looking at the medical side of things way more than I have, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into this when we talk to Representative Connolly. But I mean, it's this is like the conversation I think a lot of us that follow the science of the pandemic and also the politics, the kind of conversations we have with our extended families, who are like, yeah, I wear a mask, when I'm like near somebody on the street or maybe in a store, but like, not all the time. And yeah, I stay away from people, although, I went over grandma's last week, and hung out with her, because she's by herself. And we had a party too with some friends. People aren't really thinking through how contagious this is, right? So, neither is our government, seemingly. Like, neither is the state government. I think there's certainly not a lot. There's some pressure from some sectors of the economy, from some small businesses, from some larger ones, particularly, that are like, we need to open up now. We need to make money. The economy's going to hell. What are we going to do?
Well, in this case, I think you better talk to Mike Connolly.
Well, we're gonna. Yeah, we're just about to move into that. But I mean, just quickly on the medical tip, I mean, we do not have a treatment for the disease caused by coronavirus, COVID-19. Okay, we just do not, right? We have some possible treatments that kind of make things a little bit better, but it's certainly not a cure, and we don't even have the kind of drug cocktail like we have for HIV, another virus that we can treat, that takes 2 or 3 or 4 drugs, So yeah, maybe remdesivir or some other drug is going to be the frontline thing, but it's going to be mixed with other drugs that people are figuring out the hard way. Doctors are figuring out the hard way by having to deal with people that are dying and seeing what works and what doesn't. It's the worst possible way to do medicine. And so we don't have that, and we're not ready. We don't have a vaccine yet. I mean, you hear on the nightly news every night, on network news certainly, and in the big newspapers, well, vaccine could come by the end of this year. It could come early next year, but maybe it won't. There are plenty of medical sources and research sources saying, well, it might take 2 years. It might take 3 years. We're not quite sure. The virus is mutating, right? It's not so simple. So I think it's frankly irresponsible for the governor or any other politician, to be saying, yeah, let's do a phased, and we'll talk about this in a second, kind of a phased reopening and all this. I think that we still need a good deal of time on relative lockdown. And I mean, we should probably kick it over to Representative Connolly now, because this is something that he's been working on a lot. Why didn't we even have a full lockdown in Massachusetts? The stay-at-home order basically let a lot of people off the hook, let a lot of businesses continue to operate, many of which were called essential. And are they really essential? And people were allowed to sort of circulate a lot, and a lot of people didn't follow. There was no mask order for a long time. Very few people wore them at first. People are circulating. They're going out to parks and sitting near each other. They're near each other on the street. They're meeting friends that don't live with them. It's not like we did this thing right, and I think that's why we haven't seen the curve flatten and start to go down a little bit until recently, the curve of cases. And now, as we'll discuss, if we bring in Mike Connolly, Representative Connolly, we'll see Hey, there he is. Hey,
Hey,
Representative. Thank you very much for joining us today.
thanks for having me.
So you've been listening to this little intro into this topic. What do you have to say about where we're standing right now with the idea of reopening in Massachusetts, or you could start even earlier? What happened with the stay-at-home order and the mask order and stuff like that? Did we do any of that stuff on time in Massachusetts?
Well, again, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me, Jason. Thank you, Chris. And to answer your question, no. I mean, we've done everything a day late and a dollar short at best. When this emergency started, you probably recall Governor Baker was on vacation as myself and others in the legislature started to become concerned about coronavirus, and he cut his vacation short at some point and finally came back to the Commonwealth to begin addressing it. And ever since, we have been behind. And, to give you a comparison, around the middle of March, circa March 15th, let's say, we were at about 200 cases here in Massachusetts. The state of Washington was around 800 or 900 cases or so. So significantly ahead of us. 2 weeks later, we in Massachusetts had exceeded 10,000 cases, and they were at around 7,000 cases. Now, this is a virus that can spread in an exponential fashion. And so to see just even those differences there, I think speaks to the fact that we were too slow to act. And now it seems like we're rushing ahead to start with this reopening. And it seems like we're moving too quickly to get back to the reopening. So there's a lot of concerns.
What is the plan as we understand it right now? It's supposed to be announced officially Monday, I guess.
Yeah, it's, if you try to explain the plan to anyone on the street, any person you meet, they think it's comical. The plan is that on Monday, the stay-at-home order will end and the ban on non-essential services will end. And simultaneously, we will start the reopening. And so at present, we do have the circumstance where some businesses don't even know if they qualify for the start of the reopening, but they're assuming, well, we think we qualify. So they're telling their employees, well, on Monday, you need to report to work. But none of that has been revealed yet. So we're going to immediately, in an instantaneous fashion, transition from one framework to another framework. And I hope everyone's a good mind reader, because the framework will be revealed on Monday as to whether or not your business is essential.
And I mean, I suppose the state has already lined up all the masks everyone's going to need at work, and they have a method for checking in to make sure that businesses are being responsible about how their employees are interacting, that they're staying apart from each other and masked up, gloved up, all that, right? We got all that ready, stocks of everything we need.
No, I mean, certainly, I don't think we can say that we have the PPE for everyone who needs it. And again, yeah, the questions abound in terms of, how enforcement will work. The governor in his press conference today rattled off a long list of certain large corporations that have committed to doing work from home. So, one of the things I'm afraid is that we're going to end up being in that position where if you're some, well-paid sort of tech worker or something like that, you get to work from home. But if you're a lower wage worker, doing something that isn't paid as well, that isn't valued by society as much, you're going to be expected to risk your life. And it appears we're seeing that kind of dynamic play out, which is really unfortunate. And, just to give you a sense of where we're at, numerically, the numbers have been all over the place. I mean, we have seen a overall, improvement in terms of the trends and the hospitalization. But so far this week, we've had several days where cases have gone up. So the numbers are fluctuating. Yesterday, there were almost 1,700 new cases of coronavirus reported just yesterday. To put that 1,700 number in perspective, in Germany earlier this week, they had a 1 day total of around 900 cases, and they had started moving to open things. And when they saw those 900 cases, they actually instituted what they call an emergency break and started going back toward a lockdown. So it's almost hard to believe that the disconnect between the numbers and the reality and the impacts and the risk. And I think this sense among some that, well, we tried for a couple months and the virus isn't magically gone. So I guess that means those who aren't privileged enough to stay home will now go out and risk their lives. Well, those of us who are privileged to stay home will continue to do so. And, I think that's a moral outrage, but that's where we're at.
Certainly, as reporters, we don't see any massive groundswell for returning to status quo ante yet, and yet it's happening. Any idea why that is?
That's a wonderful question, and it's been remarkable that the statistics have borne out that the public supports the stay-at-home order. Incredible support, off the charts, basically universal support. But a few hundred Donald Trump supporters congregate in front of the State House on May 4th, and that gets wall-to-wall coverage. So we have scientists, we have medical professionals screaming that we haven't met the benchmarks, that we're exposing ourselves to a risk of resurgence. And those expert opinions are getting only a fraction of the coverage in the overall media, particularly, the corporate media, that a few Trump supporters, I could think of perhaps more derogatory words to use. I'm sure you could fill in the blanks. That a few folks are bringing, and I think that speaks to it, is the fact that if we actually had proportionate coverage that focused on the experts, that focused on the impact, maybe there would be less of a rush. But I think we have come to the point where we're now at the point where we have two choices. We can either redistribute wealth and redistribute resources to adequately serve the needs of people who are vulnerable, or we can have human sacrifice. And sadly, this is the United States of America, so that first choice isn't an option. And so what we're seeing now is really a blind rush into a reopening that, I can only hope for the best and hope that we don't see a resurgence that would send us backwards.
Well, we hope not as well. Very well put. Just to switch gears for a moment before we wrap up, we were also going to talk about what's going on with housing legislation during the pandemic. You spearheaded, along with Representative Nika Elugardo and a number of community organizations, an eviction and foreclosure moratorium, which got passed, which was amazing. Maybe you'd like to talk about that for a moment and then talk about what's been going on since then.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you for that. The governor declared the emergency March 10th, and within hours, City Life Vida Urbana and the Chinese Progressive Association, right to the city Boston, all these different housing justice groups started calling for an eviction and foreclosure moratorium. So I took that as my cue to start drafting legislation. I worked with the House Housing Chair, Kevin Honan, on filing that bill, and then we filed it that same week. It was sort of an around-the-clock effort to draft the bill. And then over the next 5 weeks or so, we faced a number of hurdles. You would think that everyone would agree that in the middle of the worst pandemic of the past century, at least, that no one should be put out on the street. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. The real estate industry, the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, the Small Property Owners Association, their position, believe it or not, and Jason, I know this won't surprise you, this was their position, stated position. Maybe we can agree that people shouldn't be put out on the street in the pandemic. We will give you that. But where we're going to draw the line, and this is what they said, we have to be able to threaten tenants.
Yeah.
As long as you allow us, still make it possible for us to threaten eviction, then we will concede we won't actually do the eviction, but we need to make it so they think they can be evicted. And that was their stated position. I was really, like I said, gratified to see 73 legislators co-sponsored our bill, and we, cleared all those hurdles. We got it through both houses of the legislature. It reached the governor's desk, and not kidding you, the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, up until the final hour, was lobbying the governor, telling him to send that back to the legislature.
Wow.
To his credit, the governor signed it. And the final thing I'll add is there's a group called the Eviction Lab, and this is made up of researchers at Princeton University and Columbia Law School, and they rate housing policy around the country. And they've actually declared that our bill is the strongest eviction moratorium in the nation. So was pleased to see that we did that. Obviously, we got to lift the ban on rent control and guarantee housing for all as a human right. So those are certain next steps, hopefully, once we get through this.
So that's where we're headed then, hopefully. Good work. And any last words before we let you go, Representative?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on, the first program here. And, I'm just so grateful for all the journalism that DigBoston does and that Binge does and all this good work. So thanks for keeping us informed.
Appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll be having you on for updates as well as other legislators in the near future. So that's it for today's show. This has been the first episode of InDIGnation. Our guest was Representative Mike Connolly, 26 Middlesex District, representing parts of Somerville and Cambridge. And, for myself, my co-host Chris Faraone, and everybody else at DigBoston, thanks very much for tuning in today, and we'll see you soon.